There's something quiet and strange about the moment you first feel yourself dim. Not the kind of dimming that happens in a room when the lights gently lower before a film starts. No, this is more like the flicker of a flame when the air grows thin. You don't notice it all at once. It begins slowly, almost lovingly, as if shrinking yourself could be a form of grace, a way to keep things peaceful. But it's not peace you're preserving, it's the illusion of being held. Welcome. In this space, we're going to explore something deep and difficult and, hopefully, liberating. This is about the moments you felt like too much for him, for them, for the world, and how that feeling might not be about you at all. This isn't about blame. It's about light. Yours. You meet him, and at first, he seems drawn to your fire. Your laughter lights up a room. Your emotions run deep, and you don't shy away from real conversation. He tells you it's intoxicating, that he's never met someone like you. You think this could be it, a match for your intensity, someone who won't flinch. But time shifts. It always does. He begins to pull back when you open further. When you speak your truth with clarity, he suddenly seems tired. When you ask for a connection, he needs space. The things he once called beautiful, your passion, your opinions, your vivid inner world, now seem to exhaust him. He doesn't say it directly, but you start feeling like a burden in your own story. You ask yourself quietly, am I too much? There's a kind of betrayal in that question, because once he loved this part of you, and now it's the part he avoids. You wonder what changed. Carl Jung once described how people meet others not as they are, but through the lens of their own inner landscape. When he first met you, he may have seen a mirror. Not a woman, but a mirror doesn't speak, it reflects. And when you began to speak, to ask, to feel, it shattered the reflection he wanted to keep. And so, the mirror cracks, not because you're broken, but because he couldn't bear to see his own emptiness reflected in your fullness. You start to notice it in the spaces between words, the way his gaze hardens when you laugh a little too loud, the subtle silence when you express excitement over something that doesn't involve him. It's not outright rejection, no. That would be too simple. It's quieter than that, more sophisticated, a pulling away disguised as composure, a clenched jaw wrapped in politeness, and each time, it leaves you wondering, did I say too much? Was I too much? But the truth is, you are expanding. That's what you do when you feel safe. When you believe you're being seen, your soul stretches to fill the room like sunlight pouring through open curtains, and he doesn't meet you there. He recoils, not always visibly, but energetically, emotionally, as if your presence dares him to feel something he's spent years avoiding. It's like walking into a room you thought was spacious only to find the walls moving inward. The more you share, the smaller it becomes, and suddenly, you're tiptoeing inside your own voice, watching your words like they're fragile things, editing yourself in real time. You once believed love was about growing together, but this love seems to ask you to shrink, to contort, to become a version of yourself that fits into the palm of his insecurities. And so, you start to make yourself small bit by bit. You laugh a little less. You use disclaimers before speaking. You wait for his mood before deciding whether to share joy or sadness. And all the while, you are negotiating with yourself. What you don't realize yet is that this shrinking isn't love. It's a survival instinct. It's what happens when you're with someone who cannot stretch with you. Someone who confuses your depth for a drama and your emotional fluency for a chaos. He doesn't know what to do with a woman who doesn't hide behind performance. A woman who exists in full color. Jung spoke often about the psyche's need for wholeness. But wholeness cannot thrive in rooms that demand you slice yourself into acceptable parts. These emotional shrinking rooms They aren't made for you, and they never were at first. You think it's your fault. That old whisper creeps in there. One that says maybe you are too much, too intense, too emotional, too ambitious, too sensual, too complicated, that if only you could dial it back, he'd come closer again. If only you could soften. Silence, simplify, you start labeling your own depth as a problem to be solved. And worse, you start believing it. That's the trap of the too much myth. It's a story written by people who couldn't hold space for the fullness of you, yet somehow convinced you it was you who needed to shrink, a subtle sleight of hand. They hand you the burden of their own smallness, and you carry it like it's yours. You start performing balanced sex. Be open, but not too vulnerable. Be sexy, but not too forward. Be brilliant, but not too outspoken. You become an emotional tightrope walker, always moving, never resting, never rooted in who you really are, because being rooted might mean being alone. And that's the terrifying part, isn't it? That if you truly showed up as you are in all your color and contradiction, he'd leave, or worse, stay and withdraw, slowly, silently, until the ache of being unseen becomes louder than the fear of being alone. But here's the deeper truth. The problem was never your too-muchness. It was his not enoughness, not in a cruel or superior way, but in the honest sense that he wasn't ready. Not ready to witness someone with an untamed soul. Not ready to meet fire without being burned. Not ready to sit in the presence of someone who doesn't need to be rescued, just respected. Carl Jung taught that people often reject in others what they cannot accept in themselves. Your emotional depth may have touched a part of him he's spent his whole life burying. You weren't too much, you were a mirror held up to a man who could not look directly at his own emotional poverty. Yes. Oh, when he flinched, when he froze, when he pulled away, it wasn't because you were overwhelming, it was because you were real. And realness doesn't play well with fragile egos pretending to be whole. You try to make it fit. You pour yourself into the shape of his comfort zone, hoping that love will bloom in compromise. But slowly, almost tragically, you begin to see that it's like trying to fit the ocean into a teacup. No matter how careful, how gentle, how willing you are to pour yourself drop by drop, it still spills, not because you are careless, but because the vessel was never made to hold you. He wants the light, but not the heat. He wants the idea of you, the alluring, effortless version without the reality of your complexity. He liked your spirit when it was playful, not when it asked for emotional courage. He loved your beauty when it was effortless, not when it required witnessing you in pain or power. Your wildness thrilled him, but your boundaries confused him, because he was drawn to the light like a moth, but terrified it might expose everything he didn't want to see in himself. And so you're left navigating a relationship where being fully yourself becomes an act of rebellion. Every time you speak up, there's resistance. Every time you express need, there's distance. You're not allowed to be the full ocean, just a pretty puddle on his floor. But what kind of love demands you stay small to feel safe? You start asking bigger questions. Why do I stay where I must dim to be loved? And more importantly, why does his inability to expand still feel like a reflection of my worth? Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but you can't fully become when someone is constantly trying to edit your edges. Your emotional landscape is vast, and his fear of depth doesn't mean you should choose the shallows. Sometimes, the very people who say you're too much are just too small to meet you there. Not bad, not evil, just unequipped. Like handing a match to someone afraid of fire and then blaming the flame when they drop it. You don't need a smaller flame. You need someone who isn't afraid to hold light in their hands. At some point, you stop trying to decode him and start listening to the ache inside yourself. It's quieter than his silences, but far more honest. And what it tells you is this: his inability to meet your emotional depth doesn't mean you are too much, it means he is not enough to hold what is not his to carry. He was never meant to be your container. He was your mirror. You're a teacher, your trigger, but not your home. You see now that the way he flinched when you got vulnerable wasn't about you being weak. It was about his discomfort with emotional intimacy. When you spoke your truth, you didn't weigh him down, you simply disrupted his illusions. You asked him to see you, and to do that, he would have had to see himself first. That's where it broke. His withdrawal wasn't punishment, it was protection, not for you, for himself. He was shielding his unhealed parts from your light. Because light, real light, does not just illuminate beauty, it reveals shadow. And not everyone is ready to look at this. Carl Jung believed the shadow holds everything we've repressed, denied, or disowned. And when someone meets a person who embodies the very qualities they've hidden from themselves — depth, passion, intuition, truth — it stirs discomfort. It challenges the ego. It destabilizes the carefully curated identity. That's what you did, simply by existing fully. You threatened the false equilibrium he had built, and so he labeled you too much to restore his sense of control. But it was never your job to make yourself more digestible. Your vulnerability was a gift. Your expression wasn't an obligation, it was sacred. And when he couldn't hold it, it wasn't because you failed. It was because he never had the arms strong enough to hold anything that wasn't hollow. There is nothing shameful about wanting to be held deeply. It is not needy. It is not excessive. It is not too much. It is human. He couldn't hold you, not because you were heavy, but because his own hands were still carrying his wounds. And no one builds connection while holding everything they refuse to face. Let that be the difference next time. Not whether they want you, but whether they can hold what you never should have had to hide. There's a strange relief in naming what happened, in calling it projection, because once you understand projection, it changes the way you carry the pain. You stop believing it's about you and start realizing it's a map of someone else's inner war, mistakenly drawn onto your skin. Jung's concept of the shadow explains it clearly. The parts of ourselves we can't accept — anger, fear, inadequacy, desire — don't vanish. We disown them, bury them, but they don't stay buried. They slip out sideways, often onto the people closest to us, especially the ones who mirror back the very qualities we're unwilling to see. You weren't too emotional. You simply made him feel the emotions he had locked away. You weren't too confident. You triggered the shame he carries about his own sense of powerlessness. Your emotional openness didn't smother him, it threatened his identity as someone who keeps it all together. And the tragedy is, he may not even realize he's doing it. That's how the shadow dances, silently, elegantly, and often destructively. He looked at your intensity and or drama. He saw your tears and labeled them unstable. He noticed your strength and called it threatening. But those weren't reflections of you. They were distortions, like seeing yourself in a cracked mirror and believing the brokenness is yours. And so you started to question your worth, to feel defective. But in truth, you were never the chaos. You were the trigger. You pressed on the wounds he never treated, and for that, you were punished. Not with violence, but with withdrawal. Not with cruelty, but with coldness. And perhaps that's even harder when someone disappears emotionally, but leaves you standing in the ruins trying to explain it to yourself. Jung taught that growth comes when we face the shadow, not flee from it. But most people run. They build relationships not to grow, but to hide, to play roles, to keep their unexamined pieces neatly boxed. And when you walk in fully yourself, unapologetic and open, it shatters the illusion. You didn't destroy him. You simply reminded him of who he still refuses to be. And no woman should be blamed for the truth her presence evokes. You thought love meant adjusting, so you became a master of subtle contortions. You learned how to quiet yourself without appearing silenced, how to soften your edges without seeming erased. Each compromise felt reasonable in isolation, but one day, you wake up in a version of yourself you barely recognize, edited, polite, tolerable, a lovable ghost of the woman you once were. You told yourself this was temporary, that all relationships take work, that maybe you were just too demanding. But deep down, there was a quiet desperation growing, because adapting to be loved is not the same as being loved for who you are. One is survival, the other is freedom. You start choosing silence in moments that used to be filled with expression. You flinch before saying something passionate, worried it'll be too intense. You delay sharing your needs until the timing feels right, and the timing never comes. Love, in this form, begins to feel like a performance, a fragile balancing act where one wrong movement might tip the whole thing into conflict. This is what it means when love starts to feel like shrinking. It's not just what you stop saying, it's what you stop being. Your voice, your creativity, your playfulness all dulled, not because he asked, but because he never truly welcomed them. You dim as a defense mechanism, not out of weakness, but out of hope. You're hoping that if you become more palatable, he'll stay. That if you just make yourself easier, quieter, simpler, he'll finally understand. But all that does is teach your nervous system that your fullness is unsafe. You begin to associate truth with tension, that being authentic means being abandoned. And that's a wound far deeper than heartbreak. It's a loss of trust in your own voice. Jung believed that the psyche rebels against fragmentation, and eventually, yours does too. Something inside you starts to resist the costume. You remember laughter that came from the gut, tears that came without shame. You remember being all of yourself without flinching. That memory becomes your rebellion, and slowly, that rebellion becomes your healing. Because no love is worth the price of vanishing inside it. There's a day you don't even see coming. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand decorations. It's quiet, clean. You simply wake up, and something inside of you is done. Not angry, not bitter, just done. The ache to be understood by him dissolves. The obsession with being enough for someone so unavailable fades like mist in morning light. You no longer rehearse the conversations in your head, hoping the right words will finally unlock him. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" and instead start whispering, "Why did I ever let myself stay this small?" That's when you leave the dollhouse, the perfectly crafted emotional replica of a real connection, to pristine, to contained, to unreal. You once thought love lived there, in its delicate rooms and scripted smiles, but it was just a stage set for a story that never truly belonged to you. Because the woman you're becoming doesn't fit on tiny furniture, she doesn't smile through discomfort or tiptoe through her truth. She doesn't live behind wallpaper dreams and pastel promises. She needs space, real, wild, and woolly space. The kind that lets her stretch. And maybe he loved the version of you that lived there, the quiet, curated you who asked for a little and offered much. But that version wasn't all of you. That version was the ego. You are the thunder. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, of reclaiming all the disowned parts of the self and letting them breathe. That's what this is. Not a breakup, not an ending, but a reclamation of your voice, your body, your boundaries. Your bigness. You begin to understand that you were never too much for a love. You were simply too real for the kind of love that wears a mask. And leaving the dollhouse doesn't mean you hate him. It just means you finally love yourself more than the fantasy. And it's in that moment, standing at the door of the tiny life you once tried to fit into, that you realize the exit isn't dramatic. It's sacred. Because nothing burns brighter than a woman who decides she will no longer apologize for her own fire. You begin walking through the world differently, not louder, not angrier, just fuller. You no longer brace for rejection when you speak your mind. You don't dilute your joy to make others feel more comfortable. You don't shrink your opinions or pause before asking for what you need. That fear of being too much no longer governs your expression. It doesn't even whisper anymore. Because now you see it clearly. Your too much was never a problem. It was a compass. Every time you were told to tone it down, you were actually brushing against your power. Every time your tears made someone uncomfortable, you were standing at the edge of emotional truth. Every time your presence felt intimidating, it was because it illuminated a space that others had left in the dark. You stopped asking small questions like, will he like me? And started asking sacred ones like, does this nourish my soul? You stopped performing emotional minimalism and started embodying your full emotional range. Grief, pleasure, longing, rage, wonder. All of it belongs. And here's the beautiful twist. The more you reclaim your too much, the more magnetic you become. Not because you're trying to attract, but because authenticity radiates. It calls to those who are no longer afraid of depth. You become a lighthouse to those still navigating their own shadow work. Not to rescue, but to remind. Carl Jung believed the soul has its own natural rhythm of becoming, and part of that becoming is integration, integrating the parts you are told to hide. The wild laugh, the untamed craving, the fierce boundary, the sacred no, the vulnerable yes, the willingness to walk away when love requires you to vanish. And now, instead of apologizing for your hunger for love, for presence, for meaning, you name it, you honor it, you let it lead you. You don't just reclaim the too much woman, you celebrate her. She becomes your altar, your compass, your language, because it was never about being too much. It was always about being exactly enough for a life that was never meant to be lived halfway. And then something shifts again, but this time it isn't a contraction. It's an expansion, a quiet, steady opening inside you. You are no longer seeking someone to complete you. You've stopped scanning the horizon for someone who might finally get it. You're not bitter. You're not guarded. You're just awake. And with that awakening, you begin to feel something rare and unfamiliar. Readiness, not desperation, not fantasy, but readiness for the kind of connection that doesn't ask you to contort, to shrink, to edit. A connection built not on rescue, but resonance. You stop chasing chemistry born of chaos and instead wait for the quiet recognition that comes when someone meets you eye to eye. A man who doesn't flinch at your passion, who doesn't mistake your emotion for instability, who doesn't see your strength as a threat but as an invitation. He won't be frightened by the way you love, because he's made peace with his own heart. He won't need to project his wounds onto your wholeness. He won't be impressed by your fire, but he'll know how to tend it. He will sit with you in silence and not rush to fix. He'll watch you unravel and not reach for a scissors, because he's done his own shadow work. He's walked through his own dollhouse and out the other side. And most of all, he won't try to shrink you because he's not afraid of what grows. Carl Jung said, your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. This man will have looked inside. And when he looks at you, he'll see not a mirror, but a person, not a project, but a partner. And the best part, by then, you won't need him. You will choose him. And in doing so, you'll rewrite the entire story of love not as something you earn by being small, but something you experience by standing tall. Not every man can hold you, but one day, someone will. And it won't feel like shrinking, it will feel like breathing. You are never too much. You are never too emotional, too loud, too intense, too complicated, too passionate, too wild. Those were not flaws, they were signs of life, of presence, of depth. The ache you felt was not a result of being unworthy, but of being unreceived. And now, you know the difference. You've walked through the shadows of shrinking, contorting, apologizing for your own existence and come out on the other side. This is not just healing. This is rebirth. Each piece of yourself that once felt like too much is now a sacred part of your wholeness. You don't need permission to feel fully. You don't need validation to speak boldly. You are no longer trying to fit into the smallness of someone else's emotional world. Instead, you are building your own, spacious, honest, radiant. Let that be your truth moving forward. You are not hard to love. You are simply loving in places that could not hold you. And now you choose differently. If this video resonated with something deep inside you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Like and share if you know someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe for more stories and reflections that continue this journey into self-awareness, emotional boundaries, and the powerful, beautiful truth of being fully you. We'll explore more next time. You're not alone.